Welcome to our channel, a place where true crime history comes alive through powerful stories, hidden facts, and untold details. Today's story is not about bullets, gang wars, or shootouts. It's about how the most feared gangster in America was finally brought down, not by guns, not by rivals, not by the FBI's raids, but by taxes. This is the story of the fall of Al Capone, how taxes ended a crime legend. The untouchable king of crime. At the height of his power, Al Capone was not just a gangster, he was an empire. By the late 1920s, Capone controlled nearly every major illegal operation in Chicago. Bootlegging during Prohibition was his golden machine. Alcohol flowed through secret breweries, hidden warehouses, and protected delivery routes, all under Capone's command. Speakeasies paid him for protection. Gambling houses sent him weekly profits. Brothels operated safely as long as his cut arrived on time. Estimates say Capone was earning over $60 million a year, an unbelievable amount for that era. Yet officially, he claimed almost no income at all. Law enforcement knew exactly who he was. Everyone did. Newspapers called him public enemy number one. Witnesses vanished. Evidence disappeared. Judges were bribed. Police officers were paid off. Jurors were threatened. Capone walked freely through Chicago, dressed in expensive suits, smiling for cameras, attending public events, donating to charities, and hosting lavish parties. He wanted to be seen, because visibility was power. It sent a message: I am untouchable. The FBI and local police tried everything. Raids failed. Witnesses refused to talk. Every murder linked to Capone collapsed in court. No one could place him directly at a crime scene. He was careful. Orders passed through layers of loyal men. To the public, it seemed impossible that Al Capone would ever fall. But while guns failed, a quieter weapon was being sharpened behind the scenes: paperwork. Not bullets, not informants, not wiretaps, numbers, receipts, bank records. The US government realized something simple yet powerful. You don't have to prove how the money was made, only that it was made and not reported. Capone believed money made illegally did not count as taxable income. That belief would destroy him. While he was busy ruling the streets, federal accountants began tracing his lifestyle. His homes, his cars, his expensive meals, his jewelry. His spending didn't match his official income, because officially, he had none. Every dollar he spent became silent evidence. Al Capone, the most violent man in Chicago, had made one fatal mistake. He ignored the tax man. And unlike witnesses or rivals, the tax system did not get scared, disappear, or accept bribes. This was the beginning of the end, the slow, invisible collapse of a criminal legend. The invisible trap: how the government closed in. While Al Capone continued to live like a king, the US government quietly changed its strategy. They accepted a hard truth: they would never catch Capone committing murder. He was too careful, too insulated, too protected. Every violent act was separated from him by layers of trusted lieutenants. Even when everyone knew he ordered killings, no one could prove it in court. So federal authorities decided to stop chasing blood, and start chasing paper. This shift marked one of the most important moments in American crime history. The tax strategy is born. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that illegal income is still taxable income. This single decision became the government's strongest weapon against organized crime. It meant bootlegging money, gambling profits, and protection fees all legally counted as income, whether criminals liked it or not. For Capone, this was disastrous. He had never filed proper tax returns. He had never declared income. He had never kept official records, or so he thought. The government assigned a team of Treasury Department investigators, accountants, and tax specialists. These were not street cops. They were quiet men with calculators, notebooks, and patience. They didn't need witnesses. They didn't need confessions. They needed math. Following the lifestyle. Instead of asking where Capone got his money, investigators asked a simpler question: how did he spend it? They documented everything: his luxury homes in Chicago and Florida, his expensive tailored suits, his diamond jewelry, his private bodyguards, his armored Cadillac, his daily meals at high-end restaurants, his gambling losses and wins. Every expense was logged. Every visible dollar created a paper trail. Even if Capone never touched a bank, money moved through people around him. Bookkeepers, bartenders, suppliers, drivers, someone always kept notes. And that was the mistake. The ledgers that changed everything. Capone believed destroying records kept him safe. But he underestimated human error and loyalty limits. Some of his associates kept private ledgers, small notebooks recording payments, wages, and collections. They didn't think of taxes. They thought of organization. Federal agents found these books during raids. Names were coded, numbers were hidden, but patterns emerged. When accountants compared these figures to Capone's lifestyle, the gap was undeniable. According to the government, Capone earned over $1 million in taxable income between 1925 and 1929, and paid $0 in taxes. That wasn't suspicion. That wasn't theory. That was evidence. Capone's overconfidence. Capone laughed at the idea of tax trouble. He openly mocked federal agents. He believed taxes were for legitimate businessmen, not men like him. To Capone, the streets were lawless, and so was money. He once said, "They can't collect taxes on illegal money." He was wrong. The government didn't need to explain where the money came from, only that it existed, and wasn't reported. Every cash purchase became a confession. Every luxury became proof. Every day he lived large without filing taxes tightened the noose. The net tightens. By 1930, Capone noticed something different. He wasn't being chased through alleyways anymore. Instead, he was being followed by men who asked questions quietly. Bank clerks were interviewed. Hotel managers were questioned. Shop owners were subpoenaed. This frightened him more than guns ever had. You could bribe cops. You could scare witnesses. You could silence rivals. But you couldn't intimidate the tax system. The government was building a case that didn't rely on fear or loyalty, only arithmetic. Al Capone, the man who survived gang wars and assassination attempts, was being cornered by columns of numbers. And soon, those numbers would become handcuffs. The trial, the conviction, and Capone's downfall. By 1931, the net had fully closed around Al Capone. Federal authorities had built a case not on fear, intimidation, or witness testimony, but on cold, undeniable evidence, his unreported income and extravagant spending. Capone, the most feared gangster in America, would soon face a courtroom where numbers and documents were more powerful than bullets. The government prepares. The case was meticulously prepared by the Treasury Department's Special Intelligence Unit. Accountants and investigators spent years compiling every ledger, every cash transaction, and every luxury item Capone owned. They matched his documented expenditures with his estimated earnings from bootlegging, gambling, and extortion. Mansion in Chicago, luxury cars and the iconic armored Cadillac, expensive tailored suits, diamond-encrusted watches and rings, lavish parties with influential politicians and socialites. Each of these expenses became a piece of evidence. Even Capone's public image of untouchability could not withstand the weight of arithmetic. The prosecutors knew Capone's men and associates would never testify against him. Violence, loyalty, and fear had ensured silence for years. So instead of relying on witnesses, they relied on the money trail, a paper fortress that Capone could not bribe, intimidate, or destroy completely. Capone's hubris. Capone walked into the trial with overconfidence. He had survived murders, police raids, and gang wars. He mocked the idea that the federal government could prosecute him over numbers. He reportedly told associates, "Taxes, let them try, they'll never get me." But confidence was not evidence. Ledgers, bank statements, and meticulous notes from informants spoke louder than swagger or threats. The government had everything in order. Detailed income estimates from illegal operations. Records of extravagant spending inconsistent with reported income. Associates, testimony about money handling without revealing identities. Even Capone's legal team, composed of some of the country's best attorneys, struggled against this type of evidence. The law was not subjective, it relied on facts and figures. Numbers, not intimidation, now had the upper hand. The trial begins. The courtroom in Chicago became the stage for a historic confrontation, the most powerful gangster in America versus the law itself. Journalists covered every moment, knowing this trial would be legendary. For the first time, the public could see Capone not as a myth or a legend, but as a man who could be held accountable. The prosecutors laid out the case. Capone earned over $1 million in a period of a few years. He reported zero income to the federal government. Every purchase, property, and expenditure was traced and documented. Defense attorneys argued that the income estimates were speculative, that Capone's wealth was hidden in complex channels, and that he had no direct bank accounts or signed checks. But the Treasury Department's painstaking calculations and detailed evidence left no room for doubt. Public fascination. The trial captured the nation's attention. Newspapers across the country printed headlines about Capone, his lifestyle, and the growing evidence. Citizens who had feared his name whispered about his impending fate. Capone's aura of invincibility was cracking. The public saw the contrast between Capone's flamboyant lifestyle and the law's methodical patience. The government demonstrated that even the most feared individuals were not beyond the reach of justice. Every day in court, Capone grew more tense. Lawyers, witnesses, and accountants presented evidence that he could not refute. The famous mob boss, who had once ruled Chicago with terror, now faced documents and figures that mocked his bravado. Conviction. On October 17, 1931, after weeks of testimonies and presentations, the verdict came, guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Capone, the untouchable gangster, was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and required to pay back taxes of over $215,000. He would serve time in some of America's most secure prisons, including Atlanta, U.S. Penitentiary and later the infamous Alcatraz. The man who evaded murder charges, corruption investigations, and public outrage could not escape the law of numbers. Capone's empire continued, but his freedom was gone. The lesson was clear: even the most powerful individuals are vulnerable to meticulous legal strategy. Legacy of the case. Capone's downfall reshaped the U.S. approach to organized crime. Numbers can be as lethal as bullets. Law enforcement learned that financial evidence could bring down criminals who were otherwise untouchable. Tax evasion became a key weapon. The government applied this strategy to other mob bosses in the years following Capone's conviction. Public faith in law enforcement grew. Citizens saw that the law could prevail over terror and intimidation. The trial also cemented Capone's legend. He remained a symbol of both the height of gangster power and the eventual triumph of the law. The headlines proclaimed, "The untouchable is touchable," and Americans remembered that arrogance, however great, has limits. Life behind bars. Capone's imprisonment and decline. After his conviction for tax evasion in 1931, Al Capone was sent to Atlanta, U.S. Penitentiary, a federal prison known for its strict routines and harsh conditions. For a man used to commanding an empire with fear and wealth, prison life was a stark and humiliating contrast. Here, Capone faced rigid schedules, minimal privacy, and constant scrutiny. Initial struggles in Atlanta. Capone quickly realized that his influence had limits behind bars. The lavish lifestyle he once enjoyed, armored cars, luxurious parties, and endless flattery, was replaced with uniforms, basic meals, and cold cells. He attempted to intimidate fellow inmates and guards as he had outside, but the prison system had measures in place to counter any potential violence. Capone was isolated from most of his criminal network, cutting him off from communication with his organization. Prison guards strictly monitored interactions to prevent the spread of fear or corruption. Despite attempts to maintain control, he had no power over decisions regarding daily routines or privileges. The gangster who had once ruled Chicago through both fear and strategy now had to adapt to rules he could not bend. He began to feel the full weight of imprisonment, not just physically but mentally, as his empire outside slowly eroded without his direct control. The infamous cell block life. Capone was assigned a standard cell, yet he tried to recreate elements of luxury. Guards occasionally allowed extra food or minor comforts, which he used strategically to win the favor of certain staff or influential inmates. However, the authorities remained vigilant, preventing him from establishing dominance like he had on the streets of Chicago. Capone was moved periodically to limit alliances and prevent plotting. Fellow inmates reported on him, and trust was a luxury he no longer enjoyed. Despite these limitations, Capone tried to maintain morale by keeping up appearances, attempting to command respect wherever possible. Declining health and the onset of syphilis. While in prison, Capone's health began to deteriorate rapidly. Years of excessive drinking, smoking, and sexually transmitted diseases culminated in progressive syphilis, which affected his brain and nervous system. Initially, it caused mental lapses and fatigue, affecting his judgment. He developed severe headaches and confusion, which made interacting with others difficult. His once formidable charisma and cunning began to fade under constant medical neglect and stress. Prison staff noted a dramatic change in his personality. The man who had been feared by Chicago's underworld now struggled with basic mental clarity, losing touch with the sharpness that had made him so notorious. Transfer to Alcatraz, the infamous island prison. In 1934, after several years in Atlanta, Capone was transferred to Alcatraz, a federal prison built to contain the nation's most dangerous and high-profile criminals. Alcatraz was isolated, heavily guarded, and virtually escape-proof, making it a final stop for Capone. The prison was designed to remove the influence of mobsters over the outside world. Communication was tightly monitored, and all privileges were minimal. Capone's daily routine included hard labor, strict schedules, and limited interaction, further eroding his confidence and control. Despite the harsh conditions, Capone still attracted attention. Guards and other inmates were fascinated by his past, often recounting his legendary status on the streets. However, Alcatraz's rigid system kept him in check, and any attempt to intimidate others was quickly neutralized. Isolation and reflection. Prison forced Capone into a life of reflection. Away from the power and luxury of his criminal empire, he confronted the consequences of his actions. The empire he built through fear, murder, and smuggling was dismantled without him, and his health issues compounded the despair. He spent long hours in isolation, reading newspapers and thinking about past mistakes. Capone's arrogance, once unchecked, was now tempered by the reality of confinement and mortality. He experienced mental and physical decline, signaling the beginning of the end of the gangster era he had dominated. Legacy of prison life. Capone's imprisonment proved that no criminal is invincible. The very man who had escaped justice through intimidation and bribery for decades was finally subdued by law, patience, and strategy. It sent a strong message to organized crime that the government could strike through legal avenues even when direct prosecution for violent crimes failed. Capone's empire outside slowly crumbled, showing the fragility of power based solely on fear. His health decline and isolation became a cautionary tale for future gangsters about the consequences of unchecked ambition and criminal excess. By the end of his time in Alcatraz, Al Capone was no longer the invincible king of Chicago's underworld. He was a shadow of his former self, his mind and body weakened, while his name remained immortalized in criminal history. The final decline and last years of Al Capone. Al Capone's final years in prison marked the complete downfall of a man who once ruled Chicago with an iron fist. By the time he was released from Alcatraz in 1939, he was physically frail, mentally impaired, and stripped of the power and wealth that had defined him. Release from Alcatraz. After nearly 7 years behind bars, Capone was released due to his deteriorating health. The progressive effects of syphilis had advanced, affecting his brain and nervous system, leaving him cognitively weakened. Unlike his bold, confident self of the 1920s, Capone now struggled with basic decision-making and memory. Doctors recommended his release as he required constant medical attention. The once feared mob boss was now incapable of returning to his criminal operations. His empire had already been dismantled, and most of his wealth was confiscated or lost through legal and illegal means. Life at Palm Island, Florida. After leaving Alcatraz, Capone retreated to his Palm Island mansion in Florida, living in seclusion with his family. This period was a sharp contrast to his former life of extravagance and constant command over the Chicago underworld. He spent his days resting, receiving medical care, and reflecting on his past. Capone's mental decline became more apparent. He repeated stories, struggled with basic tasks, and could no longer engage in complex conversations. The powerful figure who once controlled entire neighborhoods and evaded the FBI was now reduced to a shadow of his former self. Health deterioration and final days. Capone's body continued to weaken due to years of alcohol abuse, untreated illnesses, and the lasting effects of syphilis. His physical health declined along with his mental faculties. He suffered from paralysis, memory loss, and chronic fatigue. Capone could no longer live independently and required constant care from family and medical staff. The diseases that had been a minor nuisance in his youth became life-threatening in his 40s. Death and legacy. Al Capone passed away on January 25, 1947, at the age of 48, in his Florida home. The cause of death was cardiac arrest complicated by pneumonia, but his health had been compromised for years due to syphilis, alcoholism, and other ailments. Despite his criminal life, Capone remains a symbol of the American gangster era. His story illustrates how wealth, power, and fear can crumble when unchecked and eventually meet the force of law. Immortality. Today, historians, filmmakers, and writers continue to study Capone's life to understand organized crime, law enforcement strategies, and the rise and fall of notorious figures. Lessons from Capone's fall. Capone's final years are a lesson in humility, consequences, and the limits of power. No matter how untouchable someone appears, justice finds a way through law and persistence. Health and personal care cannot be ignored, as excesses in youth often lead to early decline. True power is fleeting, and even the most feared figures are vulnerable to time, law, and circumstance. Al Capone's journey from a ruthless crime boss to a frail, isolated man serves as a cautionary tale for future generations. His legend endures in American history, but his downfall reminds us that crime, no matter how cleverly executed, eventually has consequences.